Trevor is a finalist, PhD candidate. He is also coming from the College of Physical Education, New Zealand. His address is focused towards the junior researchers. His keynote will make attempt to provide comparisons with all the Blacks and the New Zealand Rugby League team and how it impacts their training and performance. This will be of interest to nutritionists and dietitians who wish to build their career in sports nutrition related interventions. And we find this critical for Kenyan athletes. Clerk is a head of department, sports performance at Australian College of Physical Education based at Sydney Olympic Park. He is an ESSA accredited L2 sports scientist. I think he will explain that to us.
Basically, that's just warning everyone here. Be careful what you say. That is a traditional opening. When we speak in our country, we offer a greeting. I will also start by saying I am definitely not a nutritionist or a dietitian, registered, clinical, or practice. What I will say, I am an exercise physiologist. I double majored in exercise physiology and sports psychology. I studied in England while I was away playing rugby league, and I've just finished a PhD through Massey University, which is the same university Paul is registered at as well. In fact, it's the same department, Food of Nutrition, Human Health, Public Health, PhD. Knowing full well that both sports are collision sports. They're not contact sports, collision. Hands up those, anyone in the room who's actually played rugby? Wow. Not one. Oh, sorry. One? Played rugby. You're in for a treat then. Rugby, league and union are collision sports. And you'll see why soon. So they involve lots of things. So standing, walking, waiting, and then they start running, jogging, to sprinting, to tackling. And it's the tackling and the collisions that are absolutely brutal. I'm about to show you a video.
Don't really want it, y'all don't really want it with me.
Doesn't matter how big they are.
I know you shook, man. You ain't built for a skirt as a nigga can be. It's gonna sound like when I'm coming, like when I'm coming, like when I'm coming for ya. It's gonna sound like when I'm coming, like when I'm coming, like when I come for ya. It's gonna sound like, yeah, here comes the, oh, here comes the, oh, here comes the. Y'all don't really want it, yeah, yeah, here comes the, oh, here comes the, oh, here comes the. Y'all don't really want it, yeah, yeah, here comes the, oh, here comes the, oh, here comes the. Y'all don't really want it, yeah, yeah, here comes the, oh, here comes the, oh, here comes the. Y'all don't really want it.
Great sport.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely a lot of energy required. So, we understand physical activity requires fuel. So, where does that fuel come from? How do we actually get to use it? How much do we need? The different intensities involved in the game require athletes to be supremely efficient at utilizing and conserving that fuel. So a lot of studies around energy expenditure have looked at how they can record and measure depletion of energy reserves. So muscle glycogen, as we understand, is fully available in muscle cells, is also stored in the liver. So dependent on the athlete, depending on their energy requirements, depending on the intensities, we need to find out how we can keep those energy reserves maintained over the 80 minutes of the game. So both games take 80 minutes to play. But here's the interesting thing about the two sports. In rugby league, the ball is in play for about 67 minutes of the 80. Yep. Rugby union, the ball is in play for just on 50 minutes of the 80. Okay? So big difference in the energy requirements between the two sports, besides the rules around the games. Okay? Rugby union have 15 players on the field. Rugby league has 13 players on the field. Okay? If you do not have carbohydrates, it doesn't work. So Bergstrom et al. In their studies, they looked at how they utilise, how we can actually sustain energy over a long period of time. So, in rugby union and rugby league, the athletes themselves are trained to sustain high efforts for 80 minutes. Having said that, not every player plays 80 minutes. And if you remember the number I said, how long the ball is in play, it's 67 minutes. Therefore, we still train to sustain 80-minute efforts, even though most players don't get to play at higher intensities, full 80. So there's been lots of studies done that break down. So how do we utilise fuel here? So the higher the carbohydrate concentration, the longer period of time we can sustain exercise. Yep, because of the burning in the carbohydrate flame. So who's heard of carbohydrate loading? I would suggest everybody here has heard of carbohydrate loading. Yeah? Good. Has anyone ever prescribed carbohydrate loading? Yes? No? Yes? It's up the back. That's great. So as a practice, what athletes are doing, what they're being advised to do is have carbohydrates continuously, to overfeed even on carbohydrates. To a certain extent, the thinking was around the more carbohydrates they have, the more they can store. Okay? Now, research has shown us that's not necessarily the case. How we utilize fuel. Okay, but Bergstrom and al. Found that by doing this, they could sustain higher levels of energy for longer periods of time. However, others also discovered, a group, Sherman et al. In 82, discovered that they did a research study on carbohydrate loading for athletes, endurance athletes. And as part of their methodology, they had athletes run a half marathon. And they did a repeat measure of half marathon running. And it was a very rigorous study. And in their study, they found there was no benefit to carbohydrate loading. Yeah? Because endurance athletes can utilize and conserve carbohydrates and burn fats as fuel. Yep. That's how endurance athletes can do it. Hansen et al. Came along a little bit later. This was in 2005. They ran another study and looked at how can we overcome this, because we all understand when you take in carbohydrates, you also absorb water. Yep. So in other words, you might be bloated, i.e. that's an extra burden to carry. And in elite athletes, that's not actually necessary. Yep. Although in rugby league, if you've just seen here, the bigger athletes normally come off better than the smaller athletes. Okay? So big is better. So they suggested cycling the glycogen loading process. And this is something that was being developed over time, and a study just recently published by MP et al. This year, 2018, they looked at the process of carbohydrate loading and how they would go about utilizing this schedule. I know it might be hard to read, but here, day one is a loading phase prior to performance. So pre-training meals high, during training high, post-training high, but the evening meal after the training load's been done is actually low in carbohydrates. So this is part of the cycling process. The next day, because this intensity is quite strong, quite high, i.e. it's quite demanding, 4 to 6 hours high intensity session consisting of multiple intervals, lactate threshold training, right on that anaerobic threshold barrier, which is hard to maintain. Okay? So day 2, 3 to 5 hours of low intensity training. Therefore, does not require too much carbohydrate. But post-training still, load up. That's the important period, post-training, load up. And evening meal high again, because on the day 3, they have another 3-hour high-intensity session. So, and day 4 is the 1-hour recovery. So you can see the thinking behind the cycling of carbohydrate loading. From the study, and looking at different authors that have published work over time, here's IMPI study down here, the 2018, looking at previous studies here. Now this shaded area is presumably the period when you would carbohydrate load as part of the training process to increase the dry weight millimoles of carbohydrate stored in the muscle. So if we load there, we can actually sustain work for longer. And you look at these dots, they are multiple training periods. Just like we saw in the previous table. So the premise around this is train high, train low, feed low. So you just keep rotating and cycling dependent on the requirements or energy requirements from that previous day's training session. So when you're doing double days, something that every elite athlete dreads, the word double day means you're training in the morning and the evening. Yep. Sometimes you have other things going on at the same time as your requirement as an elite athlete, i.e. media, or other things, family. Okay, so carbohydrates. There's been a lot done about carbohydrates. We all know also that protein itself, really, really important for athletes, for everyone, sustaining life. Protein. I remember reading about protein that comes from the Greek word protos, which means first. So it's the most, back in those times, as one of the most, or if not the most, because it's first, important nutrient for metabolism, for sustaining body composition, i.e. lean muscle mass. So in elite athletes, lean muscle mass is really important. Yep. To support the immune system, so you can offset illness and injury, which is the worst culprit of an athlete's life, and to make you feel full. Yeah? So protein. Unfortunately, what's happened is, because the marketers are so good at promoting protein, whey protein, as a way of getting the required nutrients into you, that athletes have been overloading with protein, thinking, and this is always an athlete's thinking, in my particular sports anyway, they think more is better. Yeah? So if you have more protein, you're going to have more muscle, you're going to recover quicker, you're going to be able to sustain energy metabolism at higher levels for longer. Okay. There has been a lot of research on this, and it has been shown protein, obviously, to be really important, but the danger is over. So, here's a protocol for protein feeding. 20 grams a day for 5 days. 5 servings. Yep. Obviously, that's 100 grams. So this is on top of any protein they may take in as nutrients. So they're advocating to do this loading process. The word prize includes resistance, interval, stretching, and endurance training. So resistance, which is my speciality, requires a lot of energy. Requires a lot of energy. The larger the muscle mass, the better, because we do work on triple extension exercises, which are the deadlifts, the squats, the hang cleans, the press. These types of exercises are really important for athletes because they're dynamic. Yep, they're very dynamic, and they enable you to work and, as you've seen, sustain really high intensity power. That's crucial in tackles. Crucial. We're going to look at another study soon which explains a little bit more about how that protein is critical to your success in my sport. But first, a word from my sponsor, the All Blacks. The athletes are the ones that have to be comfortable. Yep. We can't come in and tell them exactly what they should do and how they do it. We can only advise them. There are things that are definitely non-negotiable, and that's alcohol. Non-negotiable. There is no alcohol before playing any collision sport. And I would say at least 72 hours minimum. Players that have taken alcohol and have been caught, or they've been identified by the public, they usually get told, more than likely they are dropped. Some of them have been sacked, and some of them, their contracts have been torn up. So it's quite important as a professional athlete. Okay, I'm going to try and get through this. We've got 5 studies to quickly look at. Now what I will say is, none of these studies are my studies. What I've tried to do is bring in current evidence, which is trying to advise us what nutrition is best in the sports. Obviously, because the sports are quite secretive, yeah? Nobody wants to share too much information in case someone gets an advantage. So, these are published studies, and this one specifically looks at how well players understand nutrition knowledge. And this is based on the English Rugby League, where I played 12 years professionally, and my son's into his 4th year professionally. So how well do the players understand nutrition knowledge? Let's have a look, see what happens. Now, if you don't recognise this, this is published by the British Association of Public Health. And they advise, in terms of the study used here, they ask questions around the Eat Well guide. Okay? So it looks quite normal to most people. Vegetables, all the healthy, fruit, different types, breads, grains, pulses, fats, so on and so forth. So we sort of understand that as part of your Eat Well, Be Well guide. So what did the players understand about this? This is what's important. They used a nutritional knowledge questionnaire from 21 professional full-time rugby league players. Now, the good thing about this is they weren't novices. So they're 25 years of age, BMI of 27, which is actually really good for rugby league, because normally it's a lot higher. You'd expect it to be a lot higher, okay? And they had 6 plus or minus 4 degrees standard deviation of 4 years of experience. So, could have been 2, could have been 10. But quite, reasonably well-experienced players. So you'd expect these guys to understand quite a bit about nutrition, yeah? You would think so. What I will draw your attention to is also this part of this graph here. It's pretty hard to see. This is asking about level of education. Level of education. So if you're aware of the English system, which I know some of you are, secondary school, GCSEs, A levels, diploma, degree, or a health and nutrition qualification. One player had a health and nutrition qualification. So, a significant number of these players were well educated. Yep. How did that translate to their nutrition knowledge? According to the Eat Well guide, their knowledge was adequate. Adequate, 73%. The highest score that they had was their dietary advice section. That 85% of that they knew. They followed the food groups, 71%, and their food choices were reasonably good, about 70%. So that's not too bad. It's not too bad. So that's why they rated it good. Good knowledge. What they were not aware of was the recommendations of carbohydrate intake. Okay? Their carbohydrate intake was lower than recommended. They only ate starchy and fibrous foods occasionally. But the good nutrition group showed by having more fruit and vegetables. Right? Nutrition knowledge, it was correlated related to the intake of fruit and vegetables. So, but it's still rather low. It did not relate to the guide. So in other words, the players were not that well informed. They had no idea what the recommendations for carbohydrate intake was. So, what are the recommendations? What are the current recommendations for carbohydrate intake per gram per kilogram? 5 grams? 5 grams per kilogram. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So you're looking up to 55 to 60% of your daily intake, food intake, yeah? Carbohydrate. All right. So, Gatorade Sports Institute did this, and it's been around, but they are actually saying here, endurance athletes need between 6 and 10 grams per kilogram if you're using or doing moderate endurance training. If you're doing heavy endurance training, you need up to 8 to 12 grams per kilogram. Yep, carbohydrate. So to make it easy, I'm a rugby league player. If he's 100 kilos, you just multiply that by that number. And that's the recommended minimum daily dose of carbohydrates. So what they found was the athletes were under eating carbohydrates because there's been a lot of media around how bad carbohydrates are, right? Especially after 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the evening, all right? Have you heard of that? Yeah? So, but for athletes, if you remember back to the table, for athletes, the evening meals, sometimes carbohydrate intake is low, but prior to that it was high, okay? i.e. the number of, the amount of carbohydrates we take in. Power sports, if you look at that, power sports are up to the same level as heavy endurance sports, 12 grams per kilogram. And the other slide is obviously grams per pound, the other variance there. So, the athletes were not taking enough carbohydrates to sustain their exercise intensities. Bradley et al. In 2017 looked at the metabolic demands of replacing muscle glycogen. They actually ran a simulated game. This was quite a detailed study, this one. They ran a simulated game. They did lots of things prior to that simulation. 15 players are involved, approximately 21 years of age, body mass of 87 kilos, height 177 centimetres. They consumed 6 grams of carbohydrate per day for 7 days. All right? If we think back to the Gatorade, that's not going to be enough. Players were prescribed immediate or delayed post-exercise feeding in order to recover. Remember the old muscle biopsies? They were taken. So not a very enjoyable experience. Muscle biopsies were taken and blood samples were obtained 40 hours post-depletion and 48 hours after recovery. So this is the schema of the methodology. What they did, screening. This is the simulation day 4 out from the simulation. So all the demographics were taken. The loading of carbohydrates, protein, fats, on that simulation day 4 away. Peak power output tests were done. A glycogen depletion test was done. This is 2 days out from the simulation. Muscle biopsies collected here, 1 day out. Then they ran a simulated game of rugby league. Probably because of laboratory testing, they tried to control all the variables by running a simulated game to measure the output, energy expenditure. Post-simulation of the game, and unfortunately, if we looked at training alone, training does actually require high energy. Really, it does. So the simulated game, they tried to allude that it was similar to a rugby league contact sport, and they played it for 60 minutes. Bear in mind that, remember, the 67 minutes is usually in an 80-minute game. It was non-stop, continuous game. When that was completed, they also did a aggressive loading, and what did they actually find from this simulation? Surprisingly, for those who had immediate refeeding, their glycogen levels were repleted after 48 hours and onwards. For those who were delayed post-feeding, their glycogen levels were not repleted to anywhere near, although I cannot say significant levels. The wording that was used in the study, because they used the effect size of 90%, was most likely. So, it harks to a very simple premise in my sport, and any sport for that matter. If you do not take in the required nutrients, and specifically carbohydrates, immediately post-exercise, it's more than likely it delays your recovery. So, as part of my other research that I do a lot of, I'm part of a worldwide study on concussion in the rugby codes. So we've published a number of papers around concussion and collision injuries. So they also looked to try to measure the energy expenditure during training. So with the GPS units, running and high intensity running requires lots of energy. We understand that. Okay, change tack slightly, nearly there. What about the quality of diet? Now this study was carried out in Australia, okay? So, plentiful food, no worries with supply, and the best of everything really in Australia. This study involved adolescents. They looked at 25 male players, National Sports Dietitian Association, looking at what their intakes are over a certain period of time. Now, adolescents, 14 to 18 years. Question, what happens between 14 and 18 years in males? We all know. It's called puberty blues. Yeah? So they go through a massive growth spurt. So this is not accounted for in the study. But they looked at the intakes using the Australian Eating Survey, Food Frequency Questionnaire, and Diet Quality. They were assessed through the Recommended Food Score. What they found was all these 25 athletes met the recommendations for percentage of energy requirement from protein, total fat, but again, in red, our friends, not carbohydrate. Okay, so their carbohydrate intake was low, as evidence, which we understand. We've just realised that running is one thing, but the collisions are twice. The collisions are where the energy requirements are needed. If you are playing a collision sport like rugby, you need the fuel. So, fibre, calcium, iron, they met all those requirements. They had a reasonably good score in the Australian Food Score of 34 out of 73. But what they also found from the questionnaire was 14 to 18-year-olds, they don't have a very good diet. The quality is not good. Because the food is so plentiful and available, you'd think they'd be eating nutritious food. No, 38% of their daily intake was from takeaways. So, Comes back to the word education again. Education. How can we ensure that our players are prepared? The one thing I will say about this study, they were not elite athletes. Okay? So we can forgive them for having takeaways. This is Argentina versus another team.
Nicolas Bruzone into the wide open space. It goes Estelez and Muller just about gathers, giving chase, and chasing hard was William Baca. But Axel Muller was too quick for him.
Rugby sevens.
Kenya have 2 minutes to claim their place in the final. The offload was good to Frank Wanyama. Fresh legs. Wanyama needs to go round under the sticks. And Argentina through Batista Escura tries to push him out wide. Collins and Jera.
This is to win the game.
Kenya to the cup final, 40 meters out. It's climbing. It splits the post. Collins and Jera, the hero of the hour.
This is the game to get into the final, to play Fiji, who were the world champions, Olympic gold medalists. So now this is the Fijian game, the grand final. Kenya, Fiji.
Looking to muscle up inside Kenya, and now they flood the breakdown, and it comes clear. This is going to be the dream start for Kenya. Oscar Ayoni goes in for the Kenyans.
There's more to come. There's more to come.
Is good. Pretty sharp from Kenya. Dancing around is Lugonzo. Now switching to the rampaging try scorer Ayoni, and now they can clear to Wizard. The try scoring Wizard, Injera! Injera! Incredible!
Injera, Collins Injera.
And on they'll come Kenya, rumbling. Injera, he nails it down. Kenya are bringing the noise in Singapore.
Remember, Fiji are the world champions and Olympic gold medalists.
Perhaps they go the direct route. Oh, you betcha they are. Kenya, the underdogs, are serving it up to the heavyweight champs.
Second half.
Kenya chasing their first ever cup win on the circuit. Going in and away here is OU. OU's got wheels. OU's got serious wheels.
OU
goes the length. OU will be a hero in Kenya if they can hang on. There is the Gonzo. There is try score. He clears the pass as well. We're going to get another one for Kenya. It's Frank. Frank the Tank says, fill it up again.
Is it?
That's going to do it. That's going to do it. And this is why we just love sevens.
So, post-game, what do? Coach debriefed them on the field immediately, 2 minutes. They are straight into feeding. And that feeding is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. They need to make sure they get good quality carbohydrates into them. They sometimes use ice baths. And depending on where you are in the world, that could just mean a wheelie bin. You know, the bins they fill up with ice, you just chuck the ice in there. That's what that depicts. Some of them have proper ice baths at stadiums, like spa pools, and they just hop in there. The methodology we used in rugby league was normally 6 minutes in and then out, just once. Previously, they were going in and out, hot, cold immersion. Not anymore. You just immerse, stay in, then get out. Not every player does it, okay? So it's quite personal as well. All players wear compression garments. Now, if someone finds me a study that shows compression garments actually affect and improve performance, good luck. Good luck. There's not too many of those around. And a very good friend of mine actually owns a compression garment factory, or company. But it's an as much a psychological thing, not necessarily physiological. So everyone wears compression garments. You see all the athletes on the rugby, on the teams in the planes with all their compression gear on. So, in fact, in New Zealand rugby union, it's a must, compression garments. If you aren't wearing them, you could be fined. So, then they go to a break. Now, this period all happens in this time frame here. That is 30 minutes. All this happens in 30 minutes post-game. Then we have a 15 to 75-minute period where there's a break between games, between rounds. So they might have a pre-game snack depending on when their game is. Some players will also have a brief nap. You remember Paul? Emme? Paul would have brief naps all the time. Yeah. So some athletes require quick nap, and they might terminology is power nap. Okay, that's fine. As long as you get your head down, have a brief shut-eye for up to, these guys are saying, 15 to 20 minutes. Some have massage. Some use, I guess, foam rollers are quite in vogue these days. Yep, if they're not foam, they use balls as well. They have massage therapists that usually travel with teams that usually, interestingly, the massage therapist usually doubles as the nutritionist. Yeah? That's what happens. Multitasking. The coach will brief them prior to the game, 10 minutes here, and then they will go through a 20-minute warm-up prior to the game. And on the 7th Circuit, if you've not seen it, all teams play 3 games in one day. Ooh, 3 games they play. Okay? So, sorry. 3 games in one day. Then they go back the next day and do the same thing. Hopefully, 3 games in one day. If you play 3 games on day 2, you know what that means? You're in the final. That's a good thing. So you aim to play 6 games in a tournament everywhere you go, over 2 days. Very demanding, very demanding. I take my hat off to those athletes. They're very supreme athletes. And as you've just seen, Kenya, very, very good athletes. Very good at the game now. Not as challenging in the 15s, but very good in the 7s. Very similar concept to Fiji. Fiji are world champions in 7s, but not in 15s. Hard transition, hard. Okay, so this nutrition, how is important in recovery? For me and my sport and where we need to go, not necessarily for nutritionists because you already know what's required, yeah? But I'm talking about what my sport needs to do. Based on the studies that are current, education, the most important thing. Education of the athletes, yep? Because nutritionists understand, coaches sometimes understand, not always too good with it, but the nutrition is really the knowledge, education around pre and post training and games, really important. We need to understand more about how our bodies work, neuromuscular function, because it requires fuel. Yeah? Some athletes use more muscles. Hard to imagine how, but in those tackles, if you've seen, you get your body in awkward positions. Your body needs to be adaptable and reliable to sustain, but understanding a elevation neuromuscular function and trying to overcome this perceived muscle soreness. We all walk around, and I used to have a slide that started out with all my injuries, and I could go through and tell you, I don't know if you can see this arm, the ones at the front can see, my arm. I tell all the young kids, that's a shark bite, because it looks like a shark bite. But in truth, I snapped that radius making a tackle, it hit someone's shin bone, he tried to jump over me, and I hit his shin bone and snapped the radius. That was the first part in rugby league. Remember, if you make a tackle, which I did, and went down, you stand in front of the player while that player plays the ball to another player. So the first tackle broke the bone. The second tackle ripped all the ligaments and tendons of the bone. So that's when the arm just fell down and was pointing towards the ground. And the physio ran on, stuck it in my jersey, and dragged me off the field. So I have 2 titanium knees, brand new, total replacement knees. That happened 2 years ago. I have snapped my left Achilles tendon, clean, snap. just running, thought it was someone had shot me or kicked me from behind. That was my Achilles snapping. I've torn ligaments inside and outside both knees. I played the last 4 years of my career without ligaments in my knee. Yeah, how? Ooh, don't know. Just improve your quad strength and you'll be okay. So I've dislocated this shoulder 3 times. No operation though, just dislocation. Put it back in. It's funny, I saw a game the other week with New Zealand Warriors in the NRL. Played a game and the hooker dislocated his shoulder. Then I saw him trying to put his own shoulder back in on the field. Yes, true story. He had to miss 1 week for that. He came back. So it's a tough and rough game, rugby league. You've got to be prepared for injuries if you are going to play it. We need also to better monitoring of our, not only the running, the acceleration. You know what the main problem is? It's the stopping. The stopping. So deceleration actually has a higher load than the acceleration. Yeah. So we need to monitor things like that better. This was May the 7th, 1995 was my last professional game of rugby league. There you go. Questions?
We have very few sports scientists, of course, in Kenya and outside. But Kenya has athletes. Athletics is is beyond rugby. It's rugby. Then we have marathon. And when I was talking to Paul, indicated that there is this man who is in in sports science, and he's very good, very good. So if you're looking for a sports nutritionist, you can link up with sports scientist. And so it happened that he was also in the same conference. So I say, let me look for this man. So when I found him, he scared me with those many things that they do. But I say, this is okay. That's a greeting. But my thinking is that we have been talking about sports nutrition. I think Lina, the last time we were saying, how do we ensure that sports have the nutrition component? Because we have the parliament has a whole gym, and it was done to help the parliamentarians for fatigue. But do we have specialized nutritionists who can handle the parliamentarians? What about the athletes? Where do they go for steroids? Can they have better nutrition when they are in the process? And this is just to give us a thinking that as nutritionists, especially those in clinical nutrition, that is a subspecialty that can be inscribed within the clinical nutrition framework. And those who have the skills can begin to do this. But until you understand it from the practical part of it. Now, we are very happy. We want to appreciate Trevor, Clerk. I think I can't join that game whatsoever. Trevor, you will come back again, and we send you to Masinde Muliro so that you can talk to the sports scientists there. I think Masinde has, and KU. And the millions they get for just within 1 hour, we can share it as nutritionists. If you are smart and you say, okay, you get your 15 million, I get just 1% for consultation. It would be possible, isn't it? Yeah, and if we get more support from those who are in the game. So we want to appreciate Trevor in a better way.
Thank you. Thank you. Kia ora tata, kia ora tūtere whakamai a katina, au mea tu e, tāki e.
I request Daktari Mdoni to present this to Trevor. Also want to have this in New Zealand, but in a different location as from where, because Paul will carry his to Suka. Yours will remain in New Zealand. Yes. And it's just your topic, the keynote topic, and your credential, and the fact that you have the government of the Republic of Kenya and KNDI. So then automatically we give you KNDI membership. Yes, with this. So You become a friend of nutrition in Kenya, and you will have your own identity for that matter. Thank you.